At the end of World War I, the Allies gathered in Paris to decide how to shape the post-war world. And they came up with actually a number of different treaties. But for this class, we're just going to say this is the Treaty of Versailles. So yes, I do understand there are other treaties, but we're going to simplify things and simply say the Treaty of Versailles as an umbrella to cover all the other little bits and pieces. First of all, let's talk about Germany. Now, for the Allies, they decided to blame Germany for the war. Now, we've talked about the start of World War I and you've read about it, and that's not totally accurate by any means, but it gets the blame. Because of this, it is limited in its military, so it's allowed to only have 100,000 soldiers. Remember, its military was in the millions, so this puts it at a major disadvantage. But if Germany is the cause for the war, then Germany is the aggressor nation, and you need to take away its ability to attack others. They also lose territory. Now, in the map that you can see here, they're going to lose Alsace and Lorraine. Remember that little bit that Germany got in the Franco-Prussian War and France wanted it back? Well, France gets it back. So they lose that. They also lose this really weird corridor through what was old Prussia in order to give Poland access to the sea. So they actually have a country that runs through the middle of their country, which is a little weird, you must say. So they do lose some territory. They also lose the rights to their mineral assets on their borders. So for 15 years, France is allowed to use the mines that are in Germany and to take all the profit from them. And then on top of that, to protect France, there's a demilitarized zone that's established. So basically on the border with France, Germany is not allowed to have any troops. So that is to make France feel a bit better. And on top of that, because Germany is blamed for the war, it has to pay a very large indemnity. Basically, it has to pay for causing the war and the damage of the war. So it's going to be assessed billions of dollars to pay for the war. Austria has a different set of circumstances that happened to her. Now, she's not blamed for the war, although ironically, in some ways, she's more the aggressor. She's not going to have the indemnity payments assessed as much, but what's going to happen is Austria-Hungary loses 75% of their territory. So while Germany is paying for the war in cash and a small military, Austria-Hungary loses territory. So it's going to have territory given to a series of new countries that are created or recreated or expanded. So Poland, so part of her territory goes to Poland. Part of it goes to the new nation of Czechoslovakia. Territory goes to Romania, to the new nation of Yugoslavia. And also, Hungary is going to be broken off to become a separate nation. So now we're going to talk just about Austria. So Austria exists as its own little country, and then we have this whole set of new countries. That's the kind of orange territory on the map, although really they should have made Hungary orange as well. So we're going to break up. Now, in a different lecture, I'm going to talk about the problems with where they put the borders, because it's going to be a significant issue in the 1920s and 30s. But for now, just know that Austria loses 75% of her territory, and a whole new set of nations is created in Eastern Europe. Another place that they need to have treaties is in the old Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottomans fought with Germany, and therefore they lost the war. Now, in the war itself, the Arabs had been promised by the British that they would have a free state. The Ottoman Empire was ruled by the Turks. So the Turks had ruled over the Arabs. And remember, in our new kind of ideas of nationalism and things, each ethnic group, cultural group deserves its own nation. So the Arabs didn't like that the Turks were ruling over them. And so Britain had gone to them during the war and said, basically, if you help us fight the Ottoman Empire, you will get a nation. And the Arabs understood that to mean a free, unified nation. Britain later said that's not really what they promised. But What happens then is that we get these mandates, which are basically turning these areas into colonial holdings. So England is going to get the new nations of Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. So these are not existed as free independent areas. So that's going to be under British control. The British will control the governments. France is going to get what had been Syria, but she decides to divide the Syrian province into two pieces to create the new nation of Lebanon and then Syria, which is going to create very huge long-term problems in the Middle East. Ironically, Turkey, which was where the capital of the Ottoman Empire was, actually ends up independent. So the countries, the people that fought with the Allies on the winning side get to be controlled by colonial overlords, and the country that fought against the Allies ends up independent. It's a little weird. So, but we do have that as well. Now, Russia. We've talked about the fact that Russia pulled out of the war early, and she gave a bunch of her territory to Germany, or Germany claimed a bunch of Russian territory because of the fact that Russia lost. Although in a way, Russia ends up on the winning side because the Allies win. And she had made huge sacrifices before they pull out of the war in 1918. But for the Allies, they do not allow Russia to attend the negotiations that at the end of the war. They say Russia pulled out of the war early, she signed a horrible treaty, and she's going to have to live with most of it. But they don't want to give Germany that land either. So they create a whole new set of nations as well, or recreate. Some of these nations had existed in the past. So Finland is independent, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and also parts of Poland are given back to Poland. Russia had taken parts of Poland over the years, and those are returned. So although Russia ends up on the winning side, she loses territory. This is also not going to make the Bolshevik government particularly pro-Western. Remember, at this point in time, in 1919, there were also occupation troops by the Allies in Russia. So that's all not going particularly well. But for the people of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they are ecstatic. They wanted to be free. They didn't want to be part of the Russian Empire. So that is great. Another important part of what is created by the Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. Remember that World War I is to be the war that ends all wars. And if after the Napoleonic Wars you had the big five most important European countries negotiating and meeting in conferences, now what you need is to have a much wider vision of that. So the independent nations are going to have representation at the League of Nations, not just these five in Europe, but a much bigger vision of this. And the idea is that they would negotiate treaties, they would settle disputes, and the world would never again go to war because war is too costly now. So very similar to what happened at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but a much larger vision. Now, the League of Nations is going to have some problems, and I just want to highlight a couple. First of all, the United States decides not to participate. Now, Wilson actually was one of the people who proposed the League of Nations at first, but there was significant pushback in Congress and in the United and generally to participating in the League of Nations. The U.S. wanted to just go home and be isolationist, or, well, not quite isolationist, because we did have the whole of Latin America and some Pacific areas we were messing with. But generally, we did not want to be pulled into European politics ever again. But the problem with this, with the U.S. not participating, is that one of the major ways the League of Nations used to try to force nations to behave themselves was to put in economic embargoes. But the U.S. would not follow the economic embargoes. So when the League of Nations embargoed a country, the U.S. usually saw that as a new trading opportunity. So the U.S. had a tendency to undermine the embargo system. So that was a problem. Another issue is that the League of Nations was not given any kind of military function. There's no coordinated military, there's no peacekeeping troops, there's nothing like that. So if embargoes are not working, there's really not a good response after that. There's really no other way for the League of Nations to enforce its decisions. And when you have countries such as when Italy invades Ethiopia and the League of Nations tells Italy to leave and Mussolini says, nope, there's not a lot that they can do. So that is part of what will get fixed when the United Nations is created. However, I do want to point out that the League of Nations had a lot of successes. It does exist into World War II, so although it tends to disappear from U.S. history textbooks, it's still around. It is especially important in some disputes in kind of adjusting borders for some countries, and you're able to bring that to the League of Nations for mediation. And the League of Nations is especially important in things in helping with refugees, in providing disaster relief, those kinds of things, stuff that becomes like UNICEF when it becomes the UN. So although it had problems and it never functioned exactly the way it should, and certainly it did not stop World War II from happening, it did accomplish a lot of good things. And so that is a good outcome that comes from the Treaty of Versailles. So although the Treaty of Versailles is going to set up a lot of problems that actually lead us right into World War II, the League of Nations was a really good thing.